You served your country, huh? Well, this ain't the army anymore, old man. The words were spat like venom, each syllable laced with contempt. The two officers loomed over him, their shadows stretching across the damp sidewalk, swallowing him whole. Jerome Carter, a 54-year-old veteran of the Gulf War, had learned to take a punch without flinching, a kick without breaking. But words those cut deeper, especially when they came from the very people sworn to protect him. He pulled his jacket tighter. The old olive-green M65 field coat still carried the faint scent of sand and diesel, memories of a different war, a different kind of enemy. Tonight, the battlefront was a cracked stretch of pavement beside the 24-hour convenience store on 8th and Maple, and his adversaries wore badges. ID, one of them barked. Jerome's hands shook as he reached into his pocket, not from fear, but from the cold biting through his bones. He didn't have one. They knew he didn't. The taller Officer Kincaid, his name tag read, snatched the worn duffel from Jerome's feet and tossed it onto the wet ground. Clothes spilled out, along with a folded, yellowed letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Kincaid didn't bother to read it. He stepped on it with his polished boot. You're loitering. Vagrancy. That's an arrestable offense. The other officer, Briggs, said with mock formality, as though reading from a law book he barely understood. Jerome looked up at them, his gaze steady. You got a quota to fill tonight, officer? That did it. Briggs smirked, leaned in close. You people always got a mouth. Let's see if you still got one after a night in the cell. A small crowd had begun to gather, late-night shoppers, a busker packing up his guitar, a couple waiting for their rideshare. Phones stayed in pockets. Everyone looked away. Everyone except for one persona, young Latino woman standing under the awning of the store, eyes locked on the scene. She took out her phone. Jerome didn't know her name then. He didn't know she'd once been a law student before dropping out to care for her sick mother. He didn't know that she hated bullies with a passion that burned hotter than shame. All he knew was that her camera's little red recording light blinked in the dark like a lighthouse beacon. Kincaid noticed too. Put that away, ma'am. This is police business. Her voice was steady. So is public accountability. Briggs stepped toward her, hand hovering near his taser. Last warning. She didn't move. I'm not breaking any law. Jerome's heart pounded, not for himself, but for her. He'd seen this look in soldiers before, the unyielding fire of someone who refuses to back down. It scared him because he knew what came next. Kincaid turned back to Jerome. You're under arrest. Jerome didn't resist when they grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut, biting into his skin. His duffel lay abandoned, spilling his life onto the street, threadbare clothes, a dented canteen, the letter. As they shoved him toward the patrol car, the young woman's voice rang out, louder now. You're arresting a homeless veteran for standing on a sidewalk. Briggs laughed. Veteran or not, a bum's still a bum. Gasped from the small crowd. A phone camera tilted higher. Another light blinked on. Then another. The tide was turning. At the precinct, Jerome sat in the holding cell, staring at the grimy floor tiles. His wrists throbbed from the cuffs. He thought about his service, desert storms, blistering heat, the crack of gunfire, and wondered how it had all led to this. Then a voice came over the intercom, crisp and urgent. Officers Kincaid and Briggs, captain's office. Now, they didn't come back. Hours later, a desk sergeant opened Jerome's cell. You're free to go. Jerome blinked. Charges dropped. As he stepped into the cold night, he saw her, the young woman from the store, waiting under the flickering streetlight. She smiled faintly, phone still in her hand. It's all over the internet, she said. What they did to you. You're trending. Jerome didn't know what trending really meant, but he could see it in her eyes. Something had shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every man and woman who'd been silenced, shamed, or shoved aside. And somewhere, in a police department office, two careers were crumbling. Jerome had never been a man who sought attention. In fact, he'd spent the better part of the last decade avoiding it, moving from shelter to shelter, sleeping under bridges, or tucked away in alleyways where the city lights couldn't quite reach. But that night, attention had found him, and it was roaring toward him like an unstoppable train. The young woman walked beside him as they moved down the quiet street. My name's Marisol, she said, tucking her phone into her jacket. I just thought you should know. People are furious. The video's already at 2 million views. It's everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Even some news pages picked it up. Jerome shook his head slowly. Don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. You don't have to do anything, she said, glancing at him. Just know that it matters. What they did. People saw it. They can't hide it anymore. By morning, his face was on the news. Not a mugshot, but a freeze frame from Marisol's video. Jerome standing there with that unshakable, worn dignity in his eyes, while two smug officers flanked him. The caption was simple: homeless black veteran harassed by police. The internet dug in. Old service records surfaced, showing Jerome had been decorated for bravery during the Gulf War. Comment sections swelled with outrage. Hashtags spread like wildfire. The city's mayor issued a vague statement about reviewing the incident. Meanwhile, Kincaid and Briggs were placed on administrative leave, which, in police terms, often meant paid vacation. But something about this case was different. At the precinct, the air was tense. Officers avoided Kincaid and Briggs in the hallways. Reporters camped outside, shouting questions whenever they tried to leave. Inside the captain's office, the tone was less restrained. You too, Captain Morales said, pointing a finger at them, have turned this department into a national embarrassment. Do you have any idea how many complaints I've had to answer in the last 24 hours? Kincaid crossed his arms. We were just doing our job. The guy was loitering. Loitering, Morales barked. You handcuffed a war veteran. You mocked him. And it's all on camera. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Civil rights groups, Veterans Association shell, even the governor's office called me. Briggs shifted uncomfortably. It's blown out of proportion. No, Morales snapped. It's not. And you better pray it stops here, because the DA is sniffing around for criminal charges. Jerome, meanwhile, was sitting in the back corner of a small cafe, sipping black coffee Marisol had insisted on buying for him. His clothes were still damp from the misty morning air. You ever think about telling your story? Marisol asked. Jerome looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets. My story's just a long list of things people don't want to hear. I think they do want to hear it now, she said. And not just for you, for every guy out there this has happened to who didn't have a camera around. She slid her phone across the table. There's a journalist who wants to talk to you. She's been exposing police misconduct for years. Says this could be the case that forces real change. Jerome stared at the phone. He thought about the decades since he'd left the service, how promises of VA support had withered into bureaucracy and neglect. How the uniform he'd once worn with pride had become a silent weight on his shoulders. All right, he said finally. I'll talk to her. The interview went live 2 days later. It wasn't slick or flashy, just Jerome, sitting in a folding chair at a community center, talking in a low, steady voice about his service, his fall into homelessness, and the night two officers decided his dignity was worth nothing. Viewers were riveted. It wasn't just the injustice that struck them, it was his refusal to let bitterness color his words. He didn't curse the officers, didn't spit venom. He simply told the truth, and the truth hit harder than anything else could. Veterans groups began to rally behind him. Petitions were signed by tens of thousands demanding Kincaid and Briggs be fired and prosecuted. Local churches organized food drives in his name. Donations poured into a GoFundMe Marisol had quietly set up. But with visibility came danger. 3 nights later, Jerome was walking toward the shelter when a dark sedan slowed beside him. The passenger window rolled down just enough for a voice to slip out. You should keep your mouth shut, old man. The car pulled away before he could respond, taillights fading into the dark. When he told Marisol, she frowned. That's intimidation. And it's probably not random. Jerome shrugged. Not the first time someone's tried to scare me. Won't be the last. But the warning rattled her. She started walking him to the shelter every night, her eyes scanning every car that passed. Meanwhile, the investigation into Kincaid and Briggs deepened. Internal Affairs found multiple complaints in their records: use of excessive force, racial slurs, harassment cases that had been quietly buried or resolved without discipline. The viral video cracked those files wide open. The city council called for a public hearing. For the first time in their careers, the two officers would have to answer for their actions under oath, in front of the very community they'd once patrolled with impunity. The night before the hearing, Marisol came to find Jerome at the shelter. You don't have to speak if you don't want to, she told him. I've been quiet long enough, he said. The hearing was packed: reporters, activists, veterans, even families of others who'd claimed abuse by the police. Cameras lined the back wall. When Jerome stepped up to the microphone, the room went silent. He told them about the night on 8th and Maple, about the duffel bag on the wet ground, about the letter from the VA crushed under Kincaid's boot, about the words Briggs had laughed as they dragged him away. And then he told them something else. "How many times do you think this happens without a camera?" he asked, his voice carrying across the chamber. "How many men and women have stood where I stood, felt what I felt, and just disappeared? We honor our veterans with parades and flags, but when they come home broken, we look away. We let people in power treat them like trash. And if they're black, God help them." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing against the high ceiling. By the end of the week, the police chief announced Kincaid and Briggs were being terminated. The DA's office filed charges: official misconduct, civil rights violations, assault. Jerome didn't celebrate. He just sat on the shelter's front steps, the autumn wind biting at his cheeks, and watched the sun go down. Marisol sat beside him. "They're done, you know. No badge, no pension, and they might even serve time." Jerome nodded slowly. "It's not about them anymore. It's about what comes after, what we do with the space they left behind." She smiled faintly. "And what are you going to do?" He thought about it for a long moment. "Maybe I'll start by finding a home. And then, maybe I'll make sure no one else gets left behind like I did." For the first time in years, he let himself believe it was possible. The headlines didn't stop. Viral video forces police firings. Homeless black veteran speaks out against systemic abuse. Kincaid and Briggs face criminal charges. Jerome's name, once a footnote in the city's vast forgotten ledger of the homeless, had become a lightning rod. Politicians called him a hero. Activists invited him to rallies. Veterans groups wanted him to speak at their events. But with every new appearance, the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. One cold Tuesday morning, Jerome woke to find an envelope slid under the door of the shelter's office. His name was written on it in block letters. Inside was a single piece of papera, blurry photograph of him and Marisol leaving the cafe, taken from across the street. Scrawled in black marker beneath it, "Heroes die too." He stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and slid it into his jacket pocket. He didn't tell Marisol. Not yet. The criminal case against Kincaid and Briggs began moving forward. The city's district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Lenora Harris, was determined to make an example out of them. "We're not just prosecuting a single incident," she told reporters. "We're exposing a pattern. This is about accountability." The officers, flanked by their union representatives, claimed innocence. Their lawyers painted Jerome as unstable, pointing to his years of homelessness, suggesting he'd been provocative toward the officers. Jerome sat in the back of the courtroom during the preliminary hearing, hands folded in his lap. Every insult, every sideways glance from their defense team slid off him like rain on steel. He wasn't there for their approval. He was there for the truth. Outside the courthouse, tensions were rising. Protests formed on both sides of the case, activists demanding justice, counter-protesters defending the police. Chants collided in the chilly air. Police in riot gear stood between the groups, faces expressionless. Marisol stayed close to Jerome. She'd been documenting everything: the hearings, the rallies, even quiet moments of him talking to veterans who came to shake his hand. "You're in this now," she told him one evening as they walked back from court. "You didn't ask for it, but you can't step out of it. People are watching." Jerome gave a small, tired smile. "I know. Just hope I can carry it without breaking." The breaking point nearly came 2 weeks later. A local news station aired an exclusive interview with Kincaid's wife, who claimed Jerome had threatened the officers before they arrested him. No evidence, just her word. But the segment ran on loop, and soon social media swirled with people calling him a fraud, a liar, a con man. Jerome felt the old shame creeping back, in the same shame that had kept him silent all those years. That night, he walked the streets alone. Past the cafe, past the corner where it had all started, past the boarded-up buildings and flickering streetlights, until he found himself at the river's edge, the water black and endless under the moon. He didn't jump, but for the first time in a long while, he thought about disappearing again. Marisol found him there. "Don't let them take you out of the fight," she said softly, stepping beside him. "That's what they want. They can't erase the video, so they'll try to erase you." He looked at her, the streetlight casting a pale halo around her hair. "You really think I can change anything?" "I don't think," she said. I know. You already have. The trial date was set for early spring. By then, the case had drawn national attention. Civil rights leaders flew in to support him. Veterans organizations promised to flood the courtroom. Jerome prepared for his testimony. Harris coached him on the questions he'd face. The defense would try to discredit him, to twist his words, to make him seem unreliable. They'll come for your past, she warned. Your time on the streets, your service record, anything they can spin. Don't let them knock you off balance. He nodded. I've been through worse battles than this. The morning of the trial, the courthouse was swarming with cameras. Jerome wore the cleanest clothes. He owned a simple button-up shirt and a worn but pressed blazer donated by a veterans group. When he took the stand, the courtroom went still. The prosecutor walked him through the events of that night. Jerome spoke calmly, never raising his voice, never embellishing. Just the truth, steady as a drumbeat. Then came the cross-examination. The defense lawyer was a man with a polished smile and sharp eyes. Mr. Carter, he began, you've been homeless for how many years? Off and on, about 15. And during that time, you've had difficulties with law enforcement before, haven't you? Jerome didn't blink. I've been stopped, questioned, moved along, most of the time for no reason. So you have a history of confrontation with police? No, Jerome said. I have a history of surviving them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. When the trial recessed for the day, Jerome stepped outside into a wall of flashing cameras. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters waved signs. Somewhere in the chaos, he caught sight of the same dark sedan from before, idling at the curb. This time, he didn't look away. He met the shadowy figure's gaze through the tinted glass until the car rolled off into traffic. The trial stretched for weeks. The prosecution's case was solid videos, eyewitnesses, even a few officers who broke the blue wall of silence to testify about Kincaid and Briggs' past behavior. The defense flailed, their arguments growing thinner with each passing day. On the final day, Jerome sat beside Marisol in the gallery, hands clenched together. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. On the charge of official misconduct, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty. The room exploded. Cheers, gasps, a few shouted curses from the officers' supporters. Jerome just sat there, the verdict sinking into him like a slow tide. Outside, cameras swarmed. Microphones shoved toward his face. Mr. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict? He looked past them, past the courthouse steps to the street where he'd once stood powerless under the flashing lights of a patrol car. I feel like this is a start, he said. But it's not the end. Marisol touched his arm. What now? He smiled faintly. Now, we make sure no one forgets. Spring gave way to summer, and the city felt different. The corner of 8th and Maple, once just another cracked stretch of sidewalk, now carried a plaque. A small bronze plate mounted to the brick wall read, in honor of Jerome Carter, veteran, survivor, truth teller. Jerome had tried to stop them from putting it up. I'm not a hero, he'd told Marisol. But she'd just smiled and said, you are to the people who needed you to stand up when you did. The verdict against Kincaid and Briggs rippled far beyond the city limits. Police departments across the state began facing new demands for accountability: body cameras, civilian oversight boards, public transparency. Civil rights groups cited the case in lawsuits against other officers. The story even reached Congress, where a subcommittee on Veterans Affairs invited Jerome to testify. Sitting before the rows of lawmakers, he spoke about the intersection of homelessness, race, and the way the justice system treated those on the margins. It's not just about two bad cops, he said, his voice steady. It's about a culture that lets them think they can act like this and never face consequences. I served my country. A lot of people did. And we deserve better than to come home and be treated like criminals for existing. Some of the lawmakers shifted in their seats. Others nodded slowly, pen-scratching notes. Back in the city, Jerome's life began to change in small but profound ways. The GoFundMe Marisol had set up was still climbing, and with the help of a local nonprofit, he secured a small apartment, one room, a kitchenette, a window that let the morning sun spill across the worn hardwood floor. The first night he slept there, he kept waking up, certain someone would tell him to move along. By the third night, he began to believe the walls might really be his. Marisol visited often, usually with takeout. You know you've been asked to speak at 3 more events next month, right? She said one afternoon, unpacking cartons of noodles on his tiny table. He chuckled. Feels strange. I spent years trying to disappear. Now everybody wants me to talk. That's because you're not just telling your story, she said. You're telling theirs too. All the people who never got a camera in front of them. He thought about that. Guess I owe them my voice. But not everyone saw him as a symbol of hope. Hate mail arrived at his door, letters scrawled with racial slurs, anonymous threats warning him to quit while you're ahead. The same dark sedan showed up again, parked at the curb for long stretches, engine idling. Marisol wanted him to report it. He shook his head. If they wanted to hurt me, they would have done it already. This is just noise. Still, the unease lingered, a shadow in the corner of his mind. The next turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, Jerome was speaking at a Veterans Resource Center when a man in the back stood up during the Q&A. White, mid-40s, wearing a faded USMC cap. I served too, the man said, voice trembling. And I was one of the guys who used to look away when stuff like this happened. Figured it wasn't my problem. But seeing what you went through it made me realize I've been part of the problem. I'm sorry. The room went quiet. Jerome walked to him, extended his hand, and said, then start being part of the solution. The applause that followed wasn't for him, Allenite, was for the possibility of change. In the months that followed, Jerome's days filled with speaking engagements, meetings with advocacy groups, and interviews. He never got comfortable in the spotlight, but he learned to use it. He pushed for laws that would require better support for homeless veterans, stricter oversight of police misconduct, and mandatory de-escalation training. Some proposals stalled. Others gained momentum. Through it all, he stayed grounded, still visiting the shelter, still talking to the men and women there like he was one of them. Because in many ways, he still was. One late summer evening, Jerome and Marisol stood on the corner of 8th and Maple, the plaque catching the golden light. You ever think about that night? She asked. All the time, he said. I think about how close it came to just being another forgotten moment. If you hadn't been there, I was just holding a phone, she said. You were holding the truth, he replied. And you didn't let it go. They stood there in silence for a while, the city humming around them. The last public event he did that year was in front of a packed auditorium at a university. Students filled every seat, some standing in the aisles. Jerome stepped to the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and began, I'm not here to tell you a story about police officers or veterans, or even about myself. I'm here to tell you that injustice only survives in silence. It grows in the dark, in the corners where no one's watching. And the only thing that stops it is light from cameras, from witnesses, from people willing to speak even when their voice shakes. He paused, scanning the crowd. You are that light. All of you. Use it. The applause rose like a wave, rolling through the room until it felt like the walls might shake. That night, back in his apartment, Jerome sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel invisible. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more battles, more setbacks, more nights when change felt impossible. But now he had allies. He had a voice. And most of all, he had proof that even in a world built to break people like him, a single Acta camera held steady, a truth told loudly could ripple outward and topple walls no one thought would ever fall. Months later, when Kincaid and Briggs were sentenced 3 years in prison each, Jerome didn't attend the hearing. He didn't need to. The verdict had already been written the night they'd put cuffs on him and thought the world wouldn't care. The world had cared, and it had answered. As he locked his apartment door and headed down the street one bright autumn morning, a neighbor called out, "Morning, Mr. Carter." He smiled, tipping the brim of his cap. Morning. For a man who'd once been unseen, the simple acknowledgement felt like a victory. Not the final one, there was no such thing in this fight. But it was enough for today. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.